Magnitsky suffered the same fate as thousands and thousands of other people have suffered, which is the fate of a corrupt regime, the Putin regime, basically going after somebody who wanted a better country for his people. Sergei Magnitsky uncovered a massive government corruption scheme and thought that Putin and his colleagues would care about it, and so he exposed it. And instead of caring about the corruption, Putin cared about the people who were benefiting from the corruption. And they arrested Sergei, they put him in jail, they tortured him viciously for 358 days, and they killed him 6 years ago today. And the reason why this is so significant is it's not different than other cases. What's so significant about it is that the details of this case are completely known. There is no plausible deniability. There's no little green men. There's no ability for Putin and his people to say that they didn't know about this. Everything is documented. Everything about his torture is documented, and everything about the financial crime that he discovered is documented. And the reason why Putin hates this case so much is it proves that Putin is not a nationalist. He's not fighting for the national interest of Russia. He's fighting for the ill-gotten gains, the money stolen by his corrupt official. And he's fighting against patriots, people like Sergei Magnitsky. And this case is an emblematic case because of that, and has become a world-famous case because of that, because anybody who looks at it, it's so obvious that Putin is an evil man doing bad against his country. After Sergei Magnitsky was murdered, I was absolutely desperate to get some kind of justice for him. He was my lawyer. Had he not been my lawyer, he would still be alive today. And so I took a great personal responsibility to get justice. And when I went out to the world to see what kind of justice one could get, I discovered that there were no concepts of justice. That if something like this happens in Russia, there's nothing you could do. And I was so heartbroken by this and frustrated by this idea that you couldn't do anything, that I said, if no concepts of justice exist, we need to invent a new concept of justice. And I looked around at the way that the Russians behave, and they do this terrible stuff inside their own country, and then they go on vacation to Saint-Tropez, and they go to New York City shopping, and they send their kids to boarding school in Britain. And I realized that there's a huge opportunity, leverage, to basically stop these people from doing bad stuff by punishing them in the West, by taking away their visas and freezing their assets. And this was the genesis for what's become known as the Magnitsky Act in America, where the American Congress, after hearing the story of Sergei Magnitsky, passed a law which said that the people who killed Sergei, but also the people who do other terrible things, like the people who kidnapped Savchenko, those people shouldn't be allowed to travel to America, and those people should have their assets frozen. And so this is now a real law which can be implemented by the U.S. government against Russian officials who do this stuff. And so my hope is that this becomes a widespread process. So far, there are only 34 people's names on this list. 28 of them were involved in Magnitsky, 6 of them were involved in other cases. My hope is that given the thousands of human rights violators there are in Russia, that there will be thousands of people on this list. The Magnitsky law says that people who commit gross human rights abuses in Russia can be added to this list. And when I say in Russia, I should say Russian officials who commit gross human rights abuses. So if they go into Ukraine and kidnap somebody and bring them back to Russia and effectively hold them hostage, that's a gross human rights abuse. So what does one do to put somebody on the Magnitsky list? Well, the State Department says there needs to be evidence, credible evidence, of their involvement in a gross human rights abuse. So you can't just show up in Washington and denounce somebody and hope that the U.S. government is going to add them to the Magnitsky list. They won't do that. It has to be based on facts and evidence. And so what we encourage activists to do, and we've been talking to all of the victims of big crimes in Russia, is we urge them to put together documentary evidence, what they have, what they can prove to show that somebody has committed a human rights abuse. So that may not be, Putin is not going to be put on this list because he wasn't the one who signed the detention order. But a judge who signed a detention order knowing that that person didn't commit a crime could very well be put on the list.
Do you have any evidence or information that people who, while tracking the money regarding the Magnitsky case, that has something to do with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian officials or people there?
We found that in the money laundering that took place of the Magnitsky crime, from the Magnitsky crime, it went through several Latvian companies, which were also used, or the directors of those companies were also used to launder money from the Yanukovych regime. And so everybody was using the same money laundering system, the same pipes, if you will, for money laundering. And so once you start uncovering this stuff, everything connects to everything. The criminals that were involved in these types of things did them for everybody, did the money laundering for everybody. And once you start delving into it, huge amounts of money get exposed. The first thing I would say is that the next likely candidate for a realistic probability of a Magnitsky Act is Canada. Canada has a new government who's pledged to impose the Magnitsky Act. It's a domestic political issue in Canada. There's a large population of Ukrainian and other East European immigrants. And so I think Canada will be the next place to go. Here in the UK, we have a real problem, which is that there's a huge amount of Russian money sloshing around. And there's a lot of people benefiting from that in the establishment of Britain. And so even though there's many people in this country that are shocked and outraged by the Magnitsky case, there's also people being paid by the Putin regime to try to keep the system here in place. And so we're fighting against that. Ironically, Putin is probably my best lobbyist for getting a Magnitsky Act passed in the UK, because the more horrific things he does in Ukraine, the more he bombs not ISIS, but Syrian opposition, the more refugees he creates in Europe, the more it becomes impossible for even his friends and apologists to support him.
What would be probably your advice in this regard about tracking the Ukrainian dirty money?
Well, I don't think money is all that hard to track, particularly if a government wants to track it, because they have all sorts of tools that are not available to private citizens in terms of treaties with other countries that are obliged to help. The problem, as I understand it, in Ukraine is not everybody is trying to do the right thing. There is still, Ukraine is a very deeply corrupt country even after the change of Yanukovych, and there's lots of people who don't necessarily want to get to the bottom of these crimes because there's so many people who are still around who benefited from them. I'm not a government, but with a small team of people over 5 years, we've been able to trace the $230 million that led to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky to 14 different countries. And I did so without any of the powers of a sovereign state. And with the powers of a sovereign state, one could do it a lot faster and a lot better. The people who run Russia is Putin and the FSB people who are around him. And what Putin does is he creates, in order to stay in power, he creates huge rewards for loyalty, and huge punishments, like fatal punishments for disloyalty. And so in order to keep his people around him on side, you get rich if you do what he says, and you die if you in any way question what he says. And so in order to create these rewards, that's where all this money is coming from for the members of the FSB and their children and their wives. There's the daughter of the defense minister of Russia has this multi-million-dollar house, the Buddhist house outside of Moscow, worth $20 million. I mean, there's crazy stuff like that. At the end of the day, it's all of Russia, all the resources of Russia are in the hands of 10,000 people. The main mistake I made was thinking that Vladimir Putin was acting in the national interest and supporting him publicly for the first 3 years of his presidency. That was a huge mistake. I gave him legitimacy when he didn't deserve any.